Okay, on to our featured speaker, Paul Bierman. Now, a lot of people ask, so where do you find these people? Great question. And sometimes, somebody will walk up and say, have you ever read this book? And you go, oh my God, she's got to come to campus, right? Or I met the person. Well, in this case, Paul happens to be a graduate, an alumnus of Williams College. And he, of course, went to Williams College to do a talk. My daughter goes to Williams College. She was in that talk. And afterwards, she sent a text. I think I just met the next speaker at Winter's Gathering. Now, I had this really quaint image of my daughter very dutifully going up and kindly asking. And I guess the truth came out at lunch yesterday that she cornered him for 20 minutes after the talk. So she was going to get the facts correct before she sent us any news. So Paul's been just an inspiration to interact with. I mean, anybody who loves Greenland ice, I gotta love him right back. But he's a father of 2 daughters. We have a daughter. His 2 daughters are Nordic skiers. Our daughter is a Nordic skier. Where did he paddle as a young male? He paddled in the Quetico and the Boundary Waters and Portage, the Grand Portage. I need say nothing more. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Bierman.
All right, can you all hear me okay? No. Now? That's really close. Okay, I think we're gonna bring some lights down so you can see the images better. Perfect. All right, so the first thing is a thanks to you all. These last 48 hours up here have just been amazing. The depth and level of community and friendship here is invigorating. I don't know, just in the state of our world right now has made me feel really good. So I had to say that to all of you. Thank you for having me. I had a wonderful class this morning, incredible engagement. So I'm gonna tell some stories. And there are gonna be lots of different stories. They're all gonna interweave in 45, 50 minutes from now. I hope to end on a high note, we'll see, because what I'm talking about has some sadness to it and it has some loss to it, but I think it gives us a view into a potential future that's happier. So that's Greenland. I'm a professor of environmental science at the University of Vermont in Burlington. Vermont as a state is not dissimilar from where we sit right now, right? It's predominantly rural, perhaps a bit more agriculture, been settled a little bit longer, but it's cold and it gets winter. Well, at least it used to get winter. We don't get quite as much of it anymore. And snow is really important to our psyche, and cold is important to our psyche. So I'm here, I guess, in part because I was at Williams talking about this book, which I published about a little more than a year ago. And we'll talk a little bit more about the book, but the talk is not about the book, it's about the stories I learned while researching the book. And you're gonna get a little bit of science, but mostly you're gonna hear stories of people and of history and of sort of the arc of understanding Greenland and ice and glaciers and cold places. But I thought I had to give you a little background into how I got where I am so you can understand my approach to thinking through these issues. That's me at about age 5, my mom and my sister on the beach at Cape Cod. And my mom claims that she knew I was gonna be a geologist at that age because what did I do? I came home with buckets of rocks. And I dumped them in my room, but I wasn't very good at taking them out of my room. So that's me gathering rocks. My first experience with glaciers was actually, we could call this crafting. It was making a glacier cake as a geologist. God, I think it was a sophomore at Williams when I made this cake with a friend who went on to be a professional chef. Yeah, okay, so there's the glacier and the outwash streams from the glacier, and it's carved a cirque into the mountains and all that. And after 3 years at college, I had no clue what I wanted to do, so I took a year off and ended up in a town not unlike this one, a place called Greenville, Maine, which has a very big lake called Moosehead Lake and a very old steamboat, turn of the last century steamboat that they were restoring on a shoestring budget. And I was an intern for the Trust for Historic Preservation, and I learned old boat carpentry there, sort of. This is one of the guys who taught me that. It's interesting, this is many, many years ago, 1983 I was up there, 84, over a winter in Greenville, Maine, which is a really cold place to be. They're just restoring it again right now. It's been that long. A wooden boat on a freshwater lake doesn't last all that long. So I have some woodworking background. I'm very rusty. I have an interest in nautical things. I spent time at Mystic Seaport. So again, everything I've seen and learned in the last 2 days here feels really familiar and really comfortable. Biggest glacially transported rock I've ever been next to. That's me as an undergraduate. I had a lot more hair back then, and I probably weighed about 30 pounds less, but trust me, that's me. That was my senior thesis, figuring out where the ice was and where it had been, but of course it's vanished, right? That same ice sheet covered you all here that covered us in Vermont with a mile or more of ice. I got to Vermont, I started messing around with frozen lakes. So that's me in the purple vest, and we're taking cores from the lakes trying to understand what the climate had done in the last 10,000 years, and the best way to do it was on ice in the winter, because you didn't need to float around in a boat. You could just cut a hole with an ice auger like you were fishing, and then fish out 5, 6, 7 meters of muddy sediment from the bottom. This was a day in March, which was actually spectacular. We were out coring. There were worse days than that. But it wasn't until 2008 that I got to see a real ice sheet. And this was our first night camping next to the Greenland ice sheet. I was without words the first time I saw that. It is so immense. It is a scale beyond anything we can comprehend unless you have been next to an ice sheet and heard the ice crack and seen the rivers flowing out of the melting ice. It is incredibly humbling and impressive there. Greenland is 80+% covered in ice. So as someone trained as a geoscientist, if I want to look at rocks, I either have to look around the edges or you have to get underneath. And it's very expensive and difficult to get underneath. And it took about a decade after I started studying the edges before I got the opportunity to work on ice cores that went through. This is the best way to bring you to what Greenland feels like. And we should be careful of the sound on this. If the sound actually comes up, it's going to be the sounds of a very loud helicopter. But we are flying down something called the Ilulissat Ice Fjord here, and that ice fjord supposedly released the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. It's really hard to get scale, but the pilot is going to bank to make sure that we're all about to throw up very soon. He thought we were too mellow as geologists. He flew for Hollywood for a while before he flew up here. He's going to turn, and you're going to see an ice tower. That ice tower is about 250 or 300 feet high when he makes this bank and flips back the other direction. So here we're 91 degrees, and then we flip 90 the other direction. This is when the filmmaker in the back screamed, and when I wondered if I'd ever see my kids again. But that's what this place is like. It is absolute wilderness. I mean, we would fly for 6 or 8 hours a day, and we wouldn't see another person. And this was to collect rock samples around Greenland. It's just an incredible, incredible place. So Greenland has been settled by waves of immigrants. The first wave of immigrants was about 5,000 years ago. These were the Thule people. They were followed by waves of the Inuit, who came after them, and then they were followed by the Norse. And the Norse left incredible ruins, and it is haunting if you go there to be able to sit inside a Norse church, or what's left of a Norse church. And we were working in a place where the bishop's seat was, and we would sit there and we would have our lunch on the stones that 1,000 years ago was the Norse church, and the sheep were grazing around us. It's very deep history, and these various styles of building and living in a very harsh environment. In 1722, the Danes came, and this fellow Hans Egede came to find the missing Norse. Nobody knew what had happened to the Norse. He also brought Christianity, or re-brought Christianity. The Norse had brought it the first time, but he brought smallpox, and that didn't go well. That killed a number of the native Inuit, but it also killed his wife. point. That mark of Denmark is all over Greenland. The colorful houses, the architecture, the politics, although Greenland now has home rule. So it's a complicated place. It's a mixture of multiple levels of immigration over time in terms of the peoples there. And it's been a place that has attracted explorers forever and ever. And one of the earliest explorers was an American, Captain Perry. He is known for possibly being the first one to the North Pole. There's a lot of controversy about that. In fact, the person who got there first, if indeed this expedition got there, is a fellow named Matthew Henson. He's a black man. He was the most trusted companion of Perry. And when they did the sightings and the surveying and the dead reckoning, he would have been the first one to get to the pole. It's not a well-told story. They went by ship. They went from Greenland north. That's one of their ships in an earlier expedition. And this is the claim of when they made the pole. Another fellow also claimed to do it, a guy named Cook. New York Times, front page, all North Pole. So it tells you how much in the mind of Americans at that point the Arctic was and the cold was and all of that. So it's sort of a heroic story of explorers, but when you dig into it, it's actually really messy. Perry, I don't know if you could call him a eugenicist, but certainly had some very disturbing views on the people that he was working with. One of his earlier trips to Greenland, he found this meteorite, one of the largest meteorite finds, and he took it to New York on his ship. Now, you might say, okay, that's harmless. He's a rock collector. He's a geologist. He brought this meteorite back, and it was quite the adventure to bring this meteorite back that had fallen, we know, before the last advance of the ice sheets because it had been let down from the ice. There wasn't a crater around it or anything. This is what it looks like today. It's in the Museum of Natural History in New York. Okay, nothing bad so far. But he brought back 6 Inuit with him as museum displays. And 5 of those Inuit died almost immediately. The 6th one eventually grew up. There's a fellow named Minnick, that small child there, wanted to go back to Greenland, went back to Greenland, had none of the culture and none of the ability to function in his native culture, came back to the US and died in the 1918 influenza epidemic. But there's another twist to this. And I apologize because the slide apparently didn't function correctly in there. But when the first Westerners came to Greenland, they noticed that the natives had metal knives. And they were perplexed by this because they didn't think that the natives were capable of smelting ore and generating iron. Do you know where they were getting their iron from? The meteorite. That was their iron source. So now with all our fancy scientific tools, we can tell that the blades they were using and sharpening were made of the exact same metal that the meteorite was made with. So this museum piece that Perry took home was their natural resources, was their raw materials to make their knives that they were using for their hunting, for their butchering, for all those things. So it's a really dark story of the way in which Western society appropriated and really damaged the native society there. The next people up were the Germans. This is Alfred Wegener. Anybody out there know why Wegener's famous? Anybody with a little geology training? Absolutely. So he put the puzzle pieces together of the continents. And he says, all right, if we move the continents together like a puzzle, they fit. That's what he's known for, but in fact, he was a meteorologist. And he was really, that's him with his pipe in a cabin in Greenland. He set out on multiple expeditions, but his last one was 1930. And he set up a camp in the middle of the ice sheet, one on the west and one on the east side. He had, I believe, about a dozen men with him. And he wanted to take weather observations, and he wanted to study the snow. And this was his expedition. They filmed it. So this is an excerpt from a silent film. And we'll watch it, and I'll just narrate from the side here. But his men got to the ice off the ship, and the margins of these ice sheets are very steep, and they're crevassed, and they're rocky, and they're difficult to access. And so these men are, sort of humping 100-pound packs full of equipment across incredibly rough terrain. I would say far rougher than the Grand Portage that I was walking on yesterday, which seemed like a highway compared to this, and they're going over crevasses, and you can imagine that's not a light box. But they brought machines with them for the first time. This is a hybrid of an airplane and a snowmobile. It's got a pusher propeller in the back. They were built in Finland, actually, but they had to get them up this 30-degree slope at the edge of the ice sheet. And they had draft horses to do it, and they're pulling this thing up. The propeller's off at that point. They were canvas over a wood frame, not unlike a wooden canvas canoe. And they resorted to a winch, and here they're at, what, a 60-degree angle yanking this thing up. But it's really cool, because they get to the top, they fire up the engine, they put on their propeller, and off they go across the snow at 20 miles an hour. Contrast that to being on your snowshoes or your skis and slogging across the snow. So this opened up a whole new way of operating on an ice sheet that had never happened before. All right, well, let's fast forward a little bit to their camp. This is their camp at the top of the ice sheet called Ice Mitte, middle of the ice there. And they had built a sort of native-like structure out of native materials, snow, and underneath they had dug snow caves. And they spent 7 months living on top of the ice sheet like this, comfortably, because there was no wind in their caves, and they adopted the native dress to do this. So these are two of the men. They're in their sleeping bags. They have an alcohol stove. The temperature was just below freezing at the top and about 0 Fahrenheit at the floor. Big thermal gradient inside there. One man lost a couple toes to frostbite, and there are gory stories of his mates in there with a knife taking off one toe at a time as the frostbite gets worse and worse. He went on to be a very famous meteorologist. But they lived there, and they proved that living under the ice was a whole lot easier than living on the ice. This guy, and the demonic, I'll ask again, does anybody know why the demonic look on this guy, besides having been in the ice for 6 months? There's a reason he looks that way. What's that? No, he's got his toes. He's the one with his toes. Anybody photography buff here thinking?
Because he looked freezing.
He was cold, yes. The emulsions they had were slow enough that he basically had to take a 3, 4, 5 second exposure and freeze and keep his eyes open. So you end up with this very demonic look for these low light photographs like that. But this is a guy named Ernest Sorg, and he was a geoscientist, and he was cutting blocks of snow. Again, I keep coming back to materials because a lot of what they're doing is related to the material they have to work with, which is snow and ice. He wanted to know the density of the snow. So he cut a block of a particular size, and you can see he's got a balance in there, and he's measuring its weight. And from that, he determined that as he went down, and I should have mentioned this, he cut a set of stairs into the snow. Maybe he was bored, with nothing else to do. And the stairs went down and down and down, and he took blocks every time he cut them. And he got 15 meters below the surface, so 50 feet below the surface. And he measured the density of the snow, and what he learned is that the winter snow was different than the summer snow on Greenland. And the winter snow was really dense because it had been blown around and compacted and was quite dry, and the summer snow turned out to be fluffier and lighter there. And he could count years back in time, 1930, 29, 28, 27, 26, down to 1911. So he counted 20 years back in time, and as a geologist, the little lights went off, and he said, there are layers here. There's history here, and we can interrogate that. He had no tools to do that at the time, but it laid the groundwork for a lot of science we depend on today. All right, I'm going to jump ahead again. This is World War II, and America is signed the Lend-Lease Act and is sending airplanes and munitions to Europe, trying to stay away from World War II. But they couldn't put the airplanes on ships because the North Atlantic was filled with U-boats, all right? So they flew the airplanes to Europe. Well, the flights to Europe, if you were an airplane in 1941, were difficult to achieve on one tank of fuel. The biggest bombers could make it from Gander, Newfoundland to Prestwick in Scotland if they were lucky, if the winds were right. It was about 2,000 miles. But the fighter planes and some of the transports could only go 1,000, 1,200 miles. So they did a hop. They went to Presque Isle, Maine, they went to Goose Bay and Labrador, and then one of 2 bases in Greenland, and on to Reykjavik. If you've been to Iceland, Reykjavik Airport started as an American base on their World War II. And then they hopped their way to Scotland. They had no radar, they had very little weather forecasting, they were dead reckoning or they were sighting the stars to do this. It's no surprise that about 5% of those planes didn't make it, and a significant part of that 5% landed on the Greenland ice sheet. Like that. So they almost always survived landing. The problem was getting them off, and the military didn't realize how poorly they were equipped to operate in an Arctic theater. They didn't have snowmobiles that worked. They didn't have clothing that was warm enough. They didn't have rations for this. And so there are horrific stories of what happened to these airmen. Many survived, but some spent 3 or 4 months on the ice sheet getting airdrops of food and sleeping bags until spring came and they could get them off. Then a pilot decided, I could land a seaplane on the ice. And just like the Germans, things changed. Now we could land airplanes on the ice to do rescues. But that, of course, opened up a whole other thing if we could land airplanes on the ice to explore. So the Army after World War II said, wow, Soviet Union's coming online, we've got this Cold War issue that's kicking up. We need to operate in Arctic theaters. This is really practical. This is like, we have to be able to get vehicles and men working in the Arctic because our northern border is vulnerable. So I want to put the Army piece in your head because it's going to come back when we talk about climate change. The Army hired this man, a guy named Henri Bader, Swiss scientist, spoke Swiss German, was trained as a classic geologist in minerals, in the makeup of minerals. And you might say, that has nothing to do with ice, but ice is in fact a mineral. It's frozen water, it's solid water. So after he got his PhD in esoterica of minerals, he went to the Swiss Avalanche Foundation, and he studied avalanches. And the US government found him during World War II, and within a couple days of the end of World War II, he was in the US, and he was working for the US government, studying snow and ice in a very practical sense of how do we operate in these Arctic theaters. He sent men out to study snow. They're measuring the strength of snow there, the compressive strength of snow as you push on it. That's important because if you want to drive a heavy tracked vehicle across snow and it's soft, you're just going to bog it down and get nowhere. So they studied all these physical properties of snow. You'll notice that they are not wearing the native gear, and they suffered from that. Right? So the natives had figured out over thousands of years how to exist in this cold, snowy climate, and the American military took a decade or more to figure this out and get it right. But again, I'll come back to snow as a material. They started digging caves in ice, first with hand tools, and then with actually the excavators they used for coal mines. But every time they did this, the men started crafting things. This was an altar that was used for religious services in a tunnel that was 1,000 feet long, dug inside the ice sheet. And it's incredible what they did with ice as a material. I mean, here's the altar, but here are candlesticks made out of ice on here. And they're pictures of clergy holding services inside the ice sheet at this with 50, 100 men. This is from a friend I've made who was a photographer at the time. He was 18 years old when he got sent to Greenland, and he sends me these amazing photographs. So in part to connect with what people do here in terms of handwork, but realizing this is happening above the Arctic Circle. With something that people don't have to do, but it's part of their life there and trying to bring home to a place that's very alien. Bader did all sorts of things as the chief of this new division the Army had made for studying snow. He was a civilian. He was not military, but he was hired by the Army. First, he got his American citizenship. And so, again, he's a Swiss immigrant. He designed ways of delivering materials. He worked with private industry to design snowcats and things that would move on the ice. But most importantly, after Sorga's work saying there were layers in the ice, he was the first one to drill through ice and to bring up samples because he realized there was a history there. And here's where it gets interesting. The Army was caring about climate change in the late 1940s. Let that sink in, right? We still have a number of people who deny the existence or the importance of climate change, and the Army started to care in the 1940s because it was getting warmer. They didn't care politically at all. They cared because if it got warm, their tracked vehicles would sink in the slush. So Bader said, I got a way to figure out if it's been warm in the past. Is this cyclical? Is this unusual? It's going to be recorded in the ice if we can drill the ice. Now, he got that idea in 1950. And it took them 16 years after that to perfect the techniques, but they did. Nobody knew how to drill an ice core when Bader started, and by 1966, 16 years later, they had drilled almost a mile of ice. and recovered it all. I say that because what I'm going to spin around to at the end of this is we look at climate change as an intractable problem, yet in the 1960s, we figured out how to drill through ice sheets and we got to the moon. So, spoiler alert, we can solve the problem, we just need the will to do it. All right, so Bader's a great example. Let me back up here for a minute. Can we turn that volume up a bit? Yeah. So I had read and read and read about Bader as I worked on this book. And then I got an email from the National Archives. It was COVID, they were closed, and they said, we have found this recording you asked for. And it turns out that Bader did a 14-minute interview. He died in the early 90s. A 14-minute interview with the Voice of America. And so here's a man I had spent literally months thinking about, and all of a sudden I got to hear his voice, even though he was long dead. So I'm going to play just a clip of him arguing why we need to drill ice cores and why this is important.
The purpose of deep ice coring is to get information on conditions deep down in the glacier. And since conditions are simplest on the high ice caps, this is where we have been drilling.
So that's the top of the Greenland ice sheet where he's drilling, and that's 1956. Okay? And they figured out, they didn't do well the first time. They drilled, I think, 1,300 feet of ice and probably got 10% of it back. But they went back in 57 and they got maybe 30% of it back. And then they went back in 1960, and each time they went back, they got better and better and better at what they were doing. At the same time, the Army was interested in putting people inside the ice sheet. And they had learned from the Wagner experience that it was better to be in than on. They'd done enough expeditions on the top where soldiers had suffered. So they built something inside the ice, and my first significant exposure to this came out of this magazine called Real, the exciting magazine for men. Yeah, it's got Basketball's Next Scandal, How to Disappear, My Jungle is My Jail, and this is the best one, Play the New Picture Game with Marilyn. That's Marilyn Monroe, but I was not reading the magazine for that. It's this one that caught my attention, and it actually, I found out about this from an archivist at The Ohio State University who sent me a picture, a blurry picture of the magazine that was in the files of an Army, someone fairly high up in the Army who had left their files about polar expeditions with Ohio State. And that was my clue, so I actually got this off eBay. An amazing amount of my research during COVID was eBay purchasing things for $3. That libraries, this is called ephemera. Libraries don't have ephemera. Not a single library in the country has copies of Real magazine. Anyway, there's about a 10-page spread in here. We've built our military miracle in the Arctic, our secret base under the polar ice. And this thing showed up in the mail, and I was, my wife can attest to this. I'm sitting there at the table going, look at this. This is amazing. Look at this history that I can't find anywhere else. This is the illustration in there. Our secret base under the polar ice cap, and there's the C-47 that is delivering the cargo for these guys. And these are metal tubes, and inside them are heated prefab units with ping pong tables and bunks and dining facilities and cooking and generators and all those things. And this article described everything in detail. The only thing it didn't tell you is where it was. It was on the ice sheet somewhere. This is what they look like. So once I knew about this, then I could dive into other archives, and I found these are newspaper photos of the just after construction. And the snow has started to fall on this. This is probably the first fall after they were constructed, and the diesel generators are running. These are escape hatches, and I'll show you a film that you'll understand why those are there, because this is near the edge of the ice sheet. This particular one is about 10, 15 kilometers from the edge of the ice sheet. They got a lot of snow there. And inside, they nickname them sewer tubes. They're 18-foot wide steel tubes bolted together by iron workers. And the tubes weren't heated, but all the quarters were heated. And these guys are carrying something around. That's diesel fuel for sure to run their generators. But let's have a watch of this. We're probably gonna have to play with the sound on this one. This is a newsreel. At the time, after the camps have been there for a couple years. They were put in 53, this is 55. They put two of them in, one toward the center of the ice sheet, one on the edge.
On the polar ice cap of northern Greenland, winds are fierce, and temperatures often collapse to 75 degrees below zero. Here, a hearty...
All right, I'm gonna stop for a minute. What happened? How is this different from the photo I showed you? It snowed. This is 2 seasons later. The tubes are buried in snow. And about a year later, I was reading some work by a French geoscientist in an interview with him. This was based on the principle of submarine hulls. And they realized that if you built a submarine hull and there's equal pressure on the sides of it, it doesn't collapse. That was their idea. Instead of a snow tunnel or a snow cave, which will collapse, building it out of rigid material in a circle, it's going to stay for a while. And it actually did. They went back to these for 16 years. And after 16 years, the entire deformation was about a foot shortening at the top and about a foot widening at the side, which is incredible. So it worked. But yes, these are those escape hatches I showed you in the first photo.
On the polar ice cap of northern Greenland, winds are fierce, and temperatures often collapse to 75 degrees below zero. Here, a hardy group of airmen beat the weather by living literally under it, in a unique housing facility. Their complete living quarters are contained in metal cylinders interconnected by passageways. Originally placed on the surface, in 2 years, they have sunk into the relative warmth of the Arctic snow. Collecting vital weather information and experimental data, together with keeping test equipment at peak performance, is an important job. Here, the airmen melt snow for drinking water.
So, the Army was not using native materials, right? They're bringing in tons and tons of steel, and they're putting this together and all that. This was in incredible contrast to what the native Greenlanders were doing, which is existing almost, but not entirely exclusively, on these native materials. So they were near the coast using these sod huts for insulation, but you'll notice that's a non-native door, right? To their sod hut. So they were adopting pieces of flotsam and jetsam and debris from Western folks who had been to Greenland into their lives like this. But it's a huge contrast. And these first 2 stations that were put in, the Army's like, yeah, these worked great, but they're really resource intensive. So they tried something else starting in the later 50s, which is they tried working with the native materials. They used the snow as the structure for their bases. Of course, they didn't do it in a low impact way. They brought in these massive snow plows from Switzerland, which tells you Bader was involved. These were used to clear passes in the Swiss Alps. And they would go back and forth digging trenches. The longest one was 1,000 feet long. They're about 30 feet deep. They had huge chutes off the top. And I'll show you, again, film from the Army of this. This is one of these plows, and they would take a pass and cut about a foot, and they'd come back and cut another foot, and they'd come back and cut another foot. But in a summer, they laid out the entire camp. And the most interesting thing is they would put these semicircles of steel on the top, blow snow on those, let it harden for about a week. The snow would sinter because it was so cold and it had been blown. They'd pull the forms out, and the roofs would be domes of snow. They did leave the forms in one place that I'll talk about in just a moment in this camp, but they built an entire camp in the ice that way in a summer. Doing this to hold 200 men. And I won't go into the stories, it's in the book. It was men. There are several reports of women up there, but nothing I've been able to document, but some really intriguing reports, including that one of the women was a nuclear engineer. So I have this side project that keeps me busy of trying to trace these down. All right, this was not secret. That's the cover of Popular Science, which was a really popular magazine at that point. This is I have to call it a centerfold. You open up a large format magazine. It's a French magazine for young adults. It's the only color illustration in there. And this is Camp Century, which is what they called it. It was supposed to be 100 miles from the edge, therefore Century. It's actually 138 miles, but nobody wanted to call it Camp 138 miles, so they call it Camp Century. And it shows you the cargo planes. It shows you the over snow vehicles that the cargo came in with. It shows you the prefab living quarters. And here's the snowplow making things. Here are those metal forms. And here are the nuclear reactor. This is a nuclear-powered city inside an ice sheet with a portable nuclear reactor that the Army ran. It's a stunning achievement of technology and hubris on top of that. Some pictures. This is where the men lived and smoked with no ventilation inside these things. So the air quality was described as abysmal. They disposed of their sewage in essentially a giant cesspool in the snow. The sewage was hot enough that it melted its way down into the ice. And they didn't put that far enough away, so after a couple years, the soldiers complained about the stench of sewage coming in through the snow in their camp. They got their water by melting the ice sheet. They used a steam generator. They pumped steam down and they melted a well. Think about that. Instead of drilling your well, you melt your well with steam. The soldiers were drinking water from about the time of the American Revolution. Isn't that cool? You're up there and you're drinking Revolutionary War water as you're living there. One of the scientists in charge of this filtered micrometeorites out of that water. Tiny meteorites like the diameter of your hair. Millions of them would be filtered out because they pumped 10,000 gallons a day or something out of there. And they filtered enough that even with the crude analytical equipment of the time, they could analyze these meteorites. They had a full galley, right? They fed the men 4 meals a day, Arctic rations, 1.5 times what you get in the lower 48. The men came home complaining of too many steaks and too many turkeys because they had unlimited freezer space, which was the ice sheet. People went back in 1969, the last photographs of the camp after it had been abandoned and crushed, and they ate steaks for 3 weeks that were still frozen up there. And of course, because they were doing all that eating, they had the 50-man latrine and the 100-man latrine, is what they called them. Yeah, not a lot of privacy. I spare you the more explicit photos of this that I've found. But all that poop, it's still frozen in the ice sheet up there. So several million gallons of human sewage are in the ice sheet right now. This is what they call Main Street. So we want to talk cold and snow and ice and lifestyle. This is your Main Street, right? Not your Main Street here, but this is the Main Street of Camp Century. Again, this is Army propaganda, right? These are Army cinematographers up there. And they basically said, with a nuclear reactor, we have unlimited hot showers, and it's 30 below outside. And it beats winter camping anytime, right? So, you do this. We have that sink in our house at home, pretty much the exact same sink, and same little knobs. And you had electric razor. You had unlimited power. No Arctic expedition has ever had anything like this. So it's just an incredibly unusual place. They had a full medical suite there too. The news got a hold of this pretty quickly, as did the editorial cartoonists. This is 1959, the plans came out. This is Knoxville paper, and everything is wrong about this, right? So there are no mountains in the center of the Greenland ice sheet. There's no igloo-looking entrance. The natives don't look like this and didn't wear snowshoes. And there were definitely not bikini-clad women anywhere near there. But the joke on here, I think, is on atomic heat. And that this was the age of the atom, right? This is 1959. That nuclear reactor was the first of its kind. It was also the first ever to be decommissioned. So it ran for 2 years, and then they took it out. There's a long part of the book about that. But this is the nuclear reactor coming onto the ice. It was modular. There was about 300 tons of nuclear reactor they brought out. It cost about $5 million at the time. It was made in Schenectady, New York. It was never tested before it went on the ice sheet. They brought a crane to put it in, right there. Oh, and I should go back. These are D8 specially designed Arctic dozers. They weren't used for dozing. They were used to drag sleds with material across the ice, and men. It took 72 hours to get to the camp, being dragged in what they called wanigans behind this. They were living quarters, like rail cars, essentially, with bunks and food and all that. And they dragged in the nuclear fuel, and they dragged out the nuclear fuel. So the reactor was removed. There are all these stories online about a reactor left at Camp Century. It was taken to Idaho and tested and decommissioned. So the nuclear reactor was removed from there. Interestingly, about 2 weeks ago, I got an urgent text from a woman in Georgia that says, you have to talk to my neighbor. He's 89 years old. He was at Camp Century when they fired up the reactor, and he was exposed to massive amounts of radiation. There were hints to that in the research I was doing, and I spent 2 hours on the phone with this guy, which, if that story pans out, will change a lot of what we know. But the reactor didn't start well. It shed lots and lots of neutrons, which happens when you have a nuclear reaction. But it wasn't properly shielded. There wasn't enough lead around it. And so they shut it down immediately. But if this man's story is correct, there were a number of soldiers who got exposed to that when it happened. So stay tuned. But he was a wonderful gentleman. We talked as long as we possibly could before we both ran out of voice with his memories. All right, so you should be thinking, okay, why? What would motivate this kind of extraordinary work in the Arctic in the 1960s? This cartoon shows it best. This is Uncle Sam about to crash into the red iceberg. And the red iceberg is East Germany and North Korea and Czechoslovakia and China and Hungary and, of course, the Soviet Union. So it's a Cold War paranoia that I think it's very hard for someone of my age to think why would we respond like this, right? I mean, the global order right now is a little mixed up, but the extent of the paranoia at that point, I even as sort of a historian, I find really hard to understand, but I think seeing these things at the times really helps. There's another piece of this that responds to that paranoia, and it's something called Project Iceworm. Anybody heard of Project Iceworm in here? Yeah. It's the idea that we're going to put 600 nuclear-tipped missiles inside the Greenland ice sheet on rail cars and play this giant shell game with the Soviets where a missile could pop up and fire off at Moscow anytime and they wouldn't know where our missiles were. The state of Alabama, crisscrossed with railroad tracks inside the ice sheet. It was a great fantasy, nuclear-powered locomotives and all these things. It got exactly this far. That's a heavy-duty Army truck with a railroad carriage underneath it and 1,300 feet of track. They quickly proved that the tunnels were going to collapse on them, that the rails were uneven, that this just wasn't going to work. But it lasted a couple years. The web loves this, right? But the reality is that it really wasn't much of anything. But what did come out of this that has lingered and has driven my interest in this as a geoscientist and someone who studies climate is the ice coring. And this is their ice core rig. It was in a trench, super polite place to work, right? You can even take your gloves off. There's no wind. It might be 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in there. You can work with materials. And out of the movie that we're going to show next after this is over, this is one of the animations that Kathy Kasich, who was the filmmaker, did. And I should just back up for a moment. The project that I'm involved in is one that we started in 2021 with funding from the US National Science Foundation, which means all of your tax dollars have helped support what you see tonight. For research, I led that project out of the University of Vermont. We had 7 graduate students around the country. We had 40 collaborators around the world, 5 countries represented, 20 institutions, to study what was left of this Camp Century ice core. And the movie is Kathy's view on that. What you hear today from me is the history view, and they dovetail very well. And she was part of our research team. Her movie was supported by the National Science Foundation. So anyway, this is a description of the drilling, and I'm gonna let Kathy's filmmaking tell this. My voice is in here a little bit, as is a postdoc who worked with me.
This led to the collection of the very first ice core that was drilled all the way through the entire thickness of the ice sheet of Greenland, down to the bottom of it.
They got over 1,300 meters, they got to the bottom, and they kept on going. And that was just stunning for the time.
And they recovered about 3.5 meters of frozen sediment.
All right, so we're going to talk about this sediment. That's what it looks like. These are 2 men who were critical in doing this drilling and analysis, a guy named Chet Langway and Lyle B. Hansen, head driller, head geologist. No one had ever driven through an ice sheet, and no one had ever recovered 12 feet of frozen soil from the bottom of it. 1966. So they're sitting in a freezer taking this publicity photo. The interesting thing is people worked all over that ice. There must be 75 scientific papers about the ice. There are 3 about the sediment. One's like, well, what kind of rock did we find down there? The other one's, what do the sand grains look like in there? And the third one is really intriguing. It finds little fossils from freshwater lakes in there. And it says, yo, folks, the ice sheet must have disappeared if there was a freshwater lake under where it is today. Nobody paid attention to that paper. It has 20 citations in 40 years. It vanished. Anyway, we fared better than the camp. This is the camp in 1969. It was abandoned after the core was taken out. The ice crushed it. All of you know that ice and snow are dynamic. They deform, they change. The Greenland ice sheet changed a lot. That's one of the scientific buildings just smashed. So the last time somebody saw this camp, 1969, it's now under over 100 feet of snow. You go out on top of it. I have never been, but a couple of my friends have been there. It's just flat snow. You ski over it. You can find it. So that frozen soil core vanished in 1994. And I'm not going to tell the story here. You can read about it in the book if you want, but it vanished. And as I was growing up through science, I knew about this core, and everybody I talked to said, forget about it. It's gone. It melted. Someone threw it in the trash. Don't worry about it. until I got a phone call from a Danish colleague in 2019 that said, you really should come to Copenhagen in a couple weeks. We have some things we want to show you. We're having a small meeting. And so Christine actually came with me for that one, and that's me in a Danish ice core freezer. Think about something about the size of your local supermarket at minus 27 Celsius, with racks and racks of ice cores, nothing else, just ice cores in boxes. And one of those boxes was open there, and we are holding a piece of that Camp Century core. It was called the Camp Century sub-ice core, and it was cut up into bits like this that would fit in glass cookie jars. So those are actually cookie jars from Buffalo, New York, that the core was cut into and put in there, and then was in their freezers for 20 years, over 20 years, before they found it in 2019. That's what it looks like. The Danes were very generous. They sent us the piece of the bottom of the core and a piece of the top. They take the core, they slice it in half. You keep half as an archive for the future. We got the other half, and about a dozen of us worked on it. And there is far less of this core than there are of moon rocks, to tell you how rare it is. And up until about 2 years ago, no one had ever drilled through the ice sheet and gotten the sediment again anywhere. So it was really kind of precious. So because of that, we took it apart. We used brass sieves to get the big pebbles from the small pebbles, from the sand, from the clay. And then we washed everything because we didn't want to lose an ounce of this stuff. We wanted to save every last bit. So here we are, we've washed it. Those are Drew's fingers and some gloves and a plasticware that we've washed it into. And we're pouring it through a funnel with a filter. And we're trying to catch all the little bits. And as this happens, I'm staring into this. And as I said earlier, I have this history of coring lakes. I showed you that picture of being out pulling a lake core. And when we wanted to find fossil material, plants and bugs and twigs, we would do exactly this. We would take the core, we'd disaggregate it, we'd stir it up, we'd go to lunch, and the organic material, the plant material would float and the sand would sink. So imagine any lake, mucky lake here, and you put your toes in. It's that black gunk at the bottom that we're after. So we did this, and it's probably hard on this side screen to see it, but if you look, there's some little floaties in here. And those little floaties, I was staring at, this is mid-July, I'd been teaching a high school class for a week, I was beat, and it was hot. And we're in an air-conditioned lab, and I'm staring at this, and I looked at Drew, and I'm like, there are fossils in here. And Drew looks back at me, he's like, you're nuts, and he let out the string of expletives about just how nuts I was. And so I took a little set of tweezers and a pipette, and I pulled out these little black twigs, and I put them on a little white dish, and I handed them to Drew, and I said, you look at them under the microscope. And he's like, okay, yeah, fine, right, whatever. He pops them under the microscope, and there's about 30 seconds of dead silence before he lets out a scream. And that's what he saw. That is his first photograph with his cell phone down the barrel of this microscope. And he's like, you got to see this. And so there were actually 3 of us in the room, an undergraduate, this postdoc, and myself. And we just kept staring down the scope and moving it along. But what do you see when you look through that? Somebody tell me, what's that thing in the middle?
Ant.
An ant. Not quite. I bet you've seen this stuff when you've played outside. Twig. That's a twig. It's a 1/4-inch long twig on there. And you can see they're little branching on that twig. And that's a seed, and that's a piece of moss. I am not a botanist, but I know my twigs. And I'm looking at that, and I know seeds, okay? I actually didn't know that was moss at the time, but I learned moss pretty quickly. It turns out I worked very closely with 2 paleobotanists, people who understand this, and this is a tundra environment. There's no question. All the species in here are tundra species. Some like it wet, some like it dry, some like it in a place that's got snowbanks, and some like it where there aren't snowbanks. But it was thousands of these fossils by the time we got through it. And we can very well characterize that ecosystem. And we didn't find any ants, but we found the little midges that get behind your ears on there. They don't bite, they just annoy you really badly. We have not found any mosquitoes, and we were looking for a muskox, we didn't find any of that either. But the DNA folks in Copenhagen actually analyzed the sediment we have for DNA, and they did find one mammal. It's a little guy called a pika, and they run around on rocks in the Arctic. So we know there were pika there. But I've been doing science since 1980 when I first went to college. I have never had a eureka moment or one of those spine-tingling moments except for this. It dawned on us, like, wait a minute, We're looking at the soil at the bottom of the ice sheet. There was a mile of ice on top of it. And there's an ecosystem sitting here. And this did not grow under the ice sheet. And it didn't take the three of us long to go, this meant the ice sheet disappeared. And I'm just thinking about that now, I get that same feeling of like, Greenland's ice was gone. And by the end of that afternoon, we're like, this is big stuff, right? We only had these 2 samples, but it was big enough that we ended up writing a paper about it, of course. The cool part is that if you're a paleobotanist, well, I should say, if it's me, you see this and you go, huh, what is that? It's organic, maybe it's a seed. If you're a paleobotanist, you said, that's an Arctic poppy seed. And in your mind's eye, you see that seed, but actually what you're seeing is the plant. And working with these people are fantastic because they will describe a landscape based on little things under your microscope that you see. And so a woman named Hallie Mastro, who worked with me for 3 years on this, would sit me down at the microscope and say, Paul, see this? That's this plant, and that's this plant. And she'd have a key of the plants. And we built together this view of what the landscape looked like. And these are amazing flowers. I bought one from our garden shop last summer just to have it in our garden. They turn their heads with the sun during the day, and the flower tracks on there. And then this is the midge. That's the bug I was talking about. Almost perfectly preserved. So we captured this ecosystem under the ice. And what that means is that Greenland is vulnerable. And it's what led to the book. About a week after we published this paper and it got a bunch of news coverage, an editor at Norton called me and said, you need to write a trade book about this. I'm like, okay, what's a trade book? I know how to write science papers, I know how to write textbooks, I have no clue how to write a trade book. And she said, the kind of thing you pick in the airport when you want to, you're stuck and you need something to read. It took a little while, it took me 3 years to write the book that came out of this. But it was probably the best experience of my life. As I was telling some of the folks in my class this morning, it really taught me the value of communicating science beyond the science community into the far broader community, which matters because this is a very famous saying from a scientist who studies climate, a guy named Wally Broker, who unfortunately we lost about 5 years ago. But he says, climate's an angry beast and we are poking at it with sticks. Translated, we're in trouble. Climate's unpredictable. We don't know where we're going to cross the line. We're going to break the camel's back with a stick. That's his way of saying this. And I'm going to change that and X out climate and put in Greenland now, because we know the Greenland ice sheet is vulnerable. I'm going to bet there are a couple of you sitting out there going, all right, Greenland is 4,000 miles away up there. Why in Minnesota should I care about Greenland? And I'll get to that. I'm going to take a diversion to a little bit of climate science first. This is a guy named Charles Keeling. And as a graduate student in 1959, he went to the top of one of the highest points in Hawaii, and he started measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And he went to Antarctica and measured it. And he had a hypothesis that because we were burning fossil fuels, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere would be going up. He measured, this is called the Keeling curve. He measured continuously, day by day, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere until he passed away and his son picked it up. This record has been continuous since '59. A certain president in the last 6 months claimed he was going to shut down this measurement, as if stopping to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to make a difference to whether it changes or not. And it's redundant at this point, right? This is a long record, but dozens of places around the world are measuring this. So that's more political than it is meaningful. But that trend is up and up and up and up. And when I was born, it was somewhere down in here, right? When our kids were born, it was somewhere here, and today it's off the graph, up there. So carbon dioxide levels are going up. When they go up, the basic physics for this was done by a woman named Eunice Foote in the 1850s that said if you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, she did experiments, it's going to get warmer. It holds energy on the Earth. And so this is a somewhat non-intuitive diagram. I'm going to play it a couple times. But what you're watching is the temperatures. I'm going to have to back up to get it to play again. You're watching the temperatures of each month of the year averaged around the globe, and this is the year in which they're measured. And as it gets warmer, this is a degree Celsius above the background levels that we would have had before the beginning of this record. And you'll watch it increase. So let me play it again. And what it proves is that every month of the year is getting warmer, and every year is warmer than the one past it on average. So let's watch it. So here we are in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and we get up through the 2022. The world is warming. There is simply no question anymore that the world is warming. I think I could ask any of you what's changed here in Minnesota. I can tell you what's changed in Vermont. Ice comes on the lakes later. Ice leaves the lakes earlier. We get more rain on snow. We get less snow in October and November. We get early season melts. We get more hot days in the summer. We suffer more wildfire smoke. I could go on and on about the daily observations all of us in the environment see around us. But there's no debate anymore that things are changing. When you warm up the climate, guess what? You melt the ice, right? That's pretty obvious. What's not obvious is for people in coastal regions, the sea level goes up because Greenland holds about 25 feet worth of sea level in its ice sitting on land. When that ice melts on land, it goes to the ocean. And it's just like a bathtub. Ocean levels rise. So what I do with my undergrad class, about the size of the group here, is I say, everybody close your eyes. And this probably works better on the East Coast than it does in the center of the country. And imagine your favorite beach on the ocean. Now add 5 feet, now add 10 feet, now add 15 feet, now add 25 feet of water. You know, if you're in coastal Maine, the place where you bought your lobster roll, underwater. If you're in Ocean City, New Jersey, the boardwalk, underwater. If you're in Florida, half the state underwater at that point. New York City, Boston, you pick, underwater. This is a cheesy graphic, but it gives you the idea that sea level is going to rise. Okay, that doesn't matter in Minnesota. I get it. It actually doesn't even matter in Vermont, right? Because we don't have any coastal regions, but lots of things do matter. The loss of snow, the loss of winter, and I will finish with that in just a couple minutes, but this is not a new idea. This is Life magazine, 1962, and I stumbled onto this in one of the old magazines I was looking at, and I was just stunned. I'll read it to you because in the back, I'm sure you can't read this. This is a glacier called the Taku Glacier. It's in Alaska. It was the glacier Bezier first drilled in 1950, way up glacier. This is where it calves into the ocean here in its fjord. ENCO is a predecessor of ESSO, which is a predecessor of Exxon. This is the advertisement that they put in a 1962 magazine in Life. Each day, Humble is an oil company that's owned by ENCO, supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. So here's an oil company bragging about destroying winter, right? And destroying ice. The giant glacier has remained unmelted for centuries. Yet, the petroleum energy that Humble supplies, if converted into heat, could melt it at a rate of 80 tons each second, exclamation point. Things have changed, right? This is haunting to think about. All right, let's get to winter, because this is a winter festival, right? That's our favorite Nordic ski area. In November 7 years ago, this ran in the New York Times. They bought some snow guns because when we first moved there 31 years ago, you could always count on a really crappy citizens race in November on your dirt skis with that much snow and mud. But there were 5, 6, 7 years, first years were there, we never missed that race. And it wasn't the best conditions, but it was a lot of fun. And then all of a sudden, you couldn't ski at Thanksgiving anymore. So they bought a snow gun, and they had one snow gun, and they unleashed the snow gun, and they could make enough snow to have half a kilometer around their soccer fields that people could ski on. So this was November, right? The grass is still green. That's what, 2 meters wide and, I don't know, 20 centimeters deep? I tried that. I'm like, this is not Nordic skiing, right? This is like running track. And a couple of us started thinking a lot about that. And what came out of it was an idea that I would refer to, if I were teaching this, as climate adaptation. You can't make snow in November anymore, so how are you going to have snow in November at your ski area? You're going to, what's that? You're going to keep it all winter and all summer. And that was the trick. The Europeans do this a lot, especially at high altitude in their ski areas. They make snow or they farm snow the previous winter, and then they cover it with wood chips, which harkens back to a time that I'm sure the same thing happened in Minnesota, that happened in Vermont, where our ice that went into ice boxes came from lakes. And where was it stored? It was stored under sawdust in ice sheds. So we adopted some of the technologies, we thought about others, we treated it like scientists, we put in thermal sensors, and we tried different insulation strategies. And we came up with a recipe that we proposed to the owners of this ski area, which is a lot like where we are today. It's a very collaborative, community-based organization supporting athletics and not traditional crafts and folk arts, but very, very community-based. And they were trying to be as green as they could. And they were sending their semi-pro team off to British Columbia every year on airplanes. And they were like, if you can make and store snow and use less energy and cost us less than shipping our team, we're really interested in this. So I had a master's student working with me, and this is a short video that actually our daughter, who is now a film major, produced when she was in high school, of how we did this. And this is the hopeful part, at least for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, that we can at least save part of what it means to be winter and keep that season. So what you're going to see is how we went about making and storing snow over a summer, and then I'm going to show you how we spread it in the following fall. The place is called Crafts Bay Outdoor Center. If you haven't heard about it, it's an awesome, awesome place. All right, so what you saw there was, oops. Let me go back. What you saw there was the snow pile. 10,000 cubic meters of snow. You saw us using some pretty high-tech surveying equipment. It's actually what's called ground-based LiDAR. It collects thousands of survey measurements every second without us doing it. And we went out every 2 weeks, and we measured the volume of that snow pile. We watched it shrink over the summer. At the end of the summer, we had about 70% of the snow that we put in, which was amazing for a place that's 1,000-foot elevation and really hot and humid in the summer. And that meant it was practical to do it. And so this next one is just for fun. Quincy and I set up a time-lapse camera, and this is the excavation of the pile before it spread. I think it's about 5 days. You could count the number of nights you see in there. And they work a lot of nights. You'll see the equipment, heavy equipment with the lights on and everything. But first you're going to see them. We had an early snow which buried the wood chips, and they hate that. They had to scrape the early snow off, then they scraped the wood chips off, then you'll watch the excavation team and the trucking team. Just so you know, this much snow, sort of 7,000 cubic meters of snow, will put down a base about 50 centimeters thick and about 2 to 2.5 meters wide over 2 to 2.5 kilometers, depending on the year and how they spread it, which is plenty for training and for the public. And the beauty of it is it allows the center to open reliably for skiing in November. Their dorms are full, their dining hall is busy. It's been a huge economic boost to a very rural area of Vermont that didn't have a lot economically there. And it has allowed almost all of the New England teams a place to train without getting on airplanes. So there are literally hundreds of skiers. They book time on this loop. It gets so crowded, and they can only ski one direction. I basically avoid it. It's like a highway, but you know, our kids anyway, our kids have skied there. The Williams team is up there all the time. It's an amazing resource to have, and it has let us keep winter on winters where there's no winter like that. So it's been a really satisfying thing to do. So, okay, enjoy this. Oh, let's try that again. I might have to do this one manually. behaved perfectly while we were warming up here. All right, bear with me. I'm going to try one more thing, because this is so much fun, I don't want you guys to miss it. All right, cross your fingers. There we go. All right, that's the changeable Vermont weather for you there. There it is. So, someone should try that here. It's an amazing way to have skiing. Okay, so I just want to wrap. The only thing that remains of Camp Century is its ice core, and that's the material of the ice and the sediment below. This is a soldier with that ice core in 1963, I believe. We have some pieces of that ice core, and they are filled with bubbles. And hopefully you can see the bubbles from the back there. That's ancient atmosphere, frozen in when that snow became ice. And it actually is the primary data that tells us humans have changed the composition of the atmosphere. Not from Camp Century, but as geoscientists in Antarctica, we can trace carbon dioxide levels back to almost 1 million years ago through the bubbles in the ice. They're also just fantastic to look at. Up and down, those are the glaciers coming and going. Glaciers coming, glaciers going, glaciers coming, glaciers going. The pulse beat of Earth's climate. And then the Industrial Revolution hits. And we go up, and we go up, and we go up, and we go up. Today is so different than any time in the recent geologic past, and by recent, I mean millions of years, because our carbon dioxide levels are 425 parts per million. Nature, as we've evolved as humans, has never been over 300. So we're half again higher. How can we not expect to have Earth's climate respond to that? It's a huge shove for Earth's climate to be warm. And so that's the context, and I think what you have to understand in this, that's when Camp Century core was drilled. That's where we are today. It's just an incredible change since they drilled that core. So the Army played a trick that I wish I could do with you guys, but we could not carry the ice out here to do this. I do it back at the university. The Army took the core to the Pentagon to say, or the drillers took it to thank the Army brass at the Pentagon, and there's Chet Langway again with pieces of the ice core. And he went to the Pentagon and he served Coca-Cola with chunks of Camp Century ice in it. And the New York Times picked this up, and they wrote this great, really snarky piece. It says, what would you expect a soft drink cooled with ice formed 2,000 years ago to taste like? Of course, they announced that the ice was formed about the time Christ was born. So there was a little Judeo-Christian, bent on this. Anyway, the Times says the ice tasted like ice and the Coke tasted like Coke on there. In fact, it probably tasted like diesel fuel. Because when we bring these pieces of ice out, people are just like, what was that? They drilled the hole with diesel fuel as essentially a lubricant for them. That said, we've replicated this, and that's the ice in the Coca-Cola, which is really fun. But I wanted to leave you on two things. One is this photograph, and then I want to read the last couple sentences out of the book. These are 3 of my undergraduates and 1 of my TAs in a university food freezer handling pieces of this a couple weeks ago. And I have never seen students light up in a way that they did when they were holding a piece of ice that came from before the American Revolution and looking at the bubbles in there. And they wanted to turn the lights off, which we did, and then they got their iPhones out and they shone the light through the back of the ice. It is an incredibly tangible and powerful way to show that there is history in the bubbles in the ice, and they are looking at something from before they were born and before the birth of our country. So if you ever get a chance to play with a piece of glacial ice, do it. All right. I just want to read you the end of this. And I want to read you the end of this because I think there's a message from the stories I've told you tonight, from the history, and it's something I think we all need to work really hard with, and that is to communicate not only is this a problem, but it's a problem that we have been warned about, and I'm going to add that we can solve. And I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. A group of people were approached a problem that they did not know the solution to. And in a decade, they solved it. The problem was, how do you move in Arctic places? How do you deal with cold? How do you understand snow and ice? And they did it to the point where they could put 200 people under an ice sheet with a nuclear reactor, and it worked for 6 years, right? And then similar people sent folks to the moon. And we claim that we can't deal with decarbonizing our energy systems, and we can't moderate Earth's climate and control Earth's climate. I just simply don't believe that. I think the brains are out there, the smarts are out there, the handiwork is out there, the engineering is out there, that we can solve this problem. We just don't have the will to do it right now. And so my charge, my pleading to all of you is to get out and talk about that. And defend winter, defend the fact that we want a climate that lets us do traditionally what we do in the winter. We don't want 70 degrees in January, right? We want ice because it's part of human culture in parts of the world. So let me read you the last piece of this, which is the lives of so many people and the existence of so many places on our planet depend on our listening and learning from the ice and the frozen sediments beneath. And then hearing what they have to say, and what they have to say is change your ways. We should consider ourselves warned. Greenland's ice vanished before. It's time to act collectively and decisively and to stop burning fossil carbon before the ice is gone again. And I think that applies not only to Greenland's ice, but the ice we all live in. So thank you all. All right. So I've realized I went on for a long time, and I will take some questions. We have the movie over there. I'm presuming we don't have to stick to exactly the start moment of that movie.
Let's do a couple questions.
Great. And I can stay after the movie and chat to folks. We do have a couple copies of the book here. There's copies of the books up in the bookstore. So ask me questions. Yes?
Could it be determined how many years of snow had fallen from the time that the cap last melted?
Yes. And I decided not to go hard into the science tonight and to tell stories, but I'll tell you the science story. We know now that it was about 400,000 years ago that the ice last melted. I can give you all the science of that, but it's basically fossil sunlight. Is a good way to describe it. I have a colleague in Utah who measures the last time things saw the sun. And so she has made hundreds of measurements on 5 different samples, and it keeps coming back 400,000 years. We're actually happy about that. 400,000 years ago was the last time from other records we know that sea levels rose dramatically, that Earth's climate was about as warm as it is today, and it stayed that warm for about 30,000 years. That is exactly what we are headed to if we don't change our ways. The carbon we put in the atmosphere doesn't come out easy. It's going to take tens of thousands of years for that fossil carbon we put in the atmosphere to be taken up by plants, to end up dissolved in the ocean, to disappear into rocks. So we are setting ourselves up for exactly what happened 400,000 years ago, except we're shoving the climate system far harder. If the models are correct and if people don't change their ways, we should end up 3 to 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution values. 400,000 years ago was 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees. We're not only going to lose Greenland if we keep this up, we're going to lose a significant chunk of Antarctica. And then we're talking about just catastrophic loss of coastal zones. The problem is, as one of my person who helped me develop this climate class, a PhD student who then went on to teach, we have evolved into fearing lions, right? We have not evolved into fearing things that will catch up to us in 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. So climate change is not a lion. So it's really easy to say, oh, whatever. Okay, the lion's not going to take my leg off. Climate change is someone else's problem, the next generation. I think that is psychologically blocking us from taking the action we need to take. I don't know how we get around that except to keep talking to our friends and our neighbors. And I've had this discussion half a dozen times in the last 2 days here. We have to talk to people out of our echo chamber, right? If we just talk to the folks who agree with us, we talk to folks who agree with us. But if you can find someone who disagrees to talk to, and you can find a way to talk civilly, and you don't have to talk about climate change, you could talk about, well, how's the ice today? Why aren't you out ice fishing? Oh, it's too thin. Oh, it's January. Oh, is that the way it used to be? There are ways to engage like this. If it's a farmer, you can say, how's your soybean crop doing this year, right? Oh, it was really dry. How's your well doing? There are other ways to get at this besides saying we have to save the earth from climate change. There are ways to say we want to maintain our lifestyle, as it were, and climate change is interfering with our lifestyle, be it Nordic skiing or growing alfalfa, right? So I think you have to meet people where they are, but we have to get out of our comfort zone and the people we know will affirm what we believe and start talking to folks who think differently. All the way in the back there, yeah.
I don't know if it'll happen in time, but I'm kind of hopeful in a weird way that I do commercial salmon fishing in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much the captain of most of those boats would have told you that like climate change is a bunch of BS and they have no interest in it. Well, I tell you what, the last few seasons, the salmon don't know a calendar. The salmon come back to mate based on the water temperature. And so you've got salmon out there rotting because they're not coming back in time. Believe me, those captains are real interested in climate change now.
And yeah, you are so right. And I think what's happened is we started off, the prediction of climate change, even Exxon predicted the climate change we're seeing now in the 70s. Their internal documents that have since been released and leaked showed their models are bang on what's happened, but we didn't feel it yet. We couldn't separate it from the noise of the weather that we all know, right? A cold November, a warm November, all this. Now it's unavoidable, and it doesn't matter where you live. You're seeing it. And you're seeing it in Alaska, the salmon fishermen are seeing it, we're seeing it in Vermont, they're seeing it in Florida. Anywhere you go, you're seeing it. And so the argument that doesn't exist is gone. It's been replaced with, oh, it's too expensive to deal with it, or it's too difficult to deal with it. And that to me is also fallacious at this point. It's cheaper to put in non-fossil fuel energy generation services now than it is to build coal and gas and petroleum-fired power plants. Solar and wind are cheaper, and they're not alternative energies. They're different energy supplies. So from an economic point of view, it now makes sense to use non-carbon energy supplies. Yeah, you have issues to deal with batteries and intermittency and all those pieces, but it's a solvable problem. And I guess I couldn't be doing this if I didn't have a positive view on things. We just have to figure out a way to do it. We are smart people the world over. American engineers and scientists have solved an incredible number of problems. We somehow need to get the will as a society to go ahead and do this. And I got to keep smiling. I got to keep thinking that's going to happen. Otherwise, I don't know. What would you do, right? Let's try someone who hasn't asked a question yet. Yeah.
That's a little adjacent, but as far as saving the snow, could that be used for preventing floods and remediating drought?
Oh, that's an interesting thought. I've not seen those done, but there are, I don't know that's happened in the US, but it's happened in Japan. They have saved the snow and used it for air conditioning in the summer by running a heat exchanging loop through the snow. So instead of an evaporative cooler, you run that through your snow and you melt the snow, but I don't want to say capture the cold because you're capturing the heat with the snow, right? But you're chilling water and you can run it through a chill water system for air conditioning. And in urban areas, I mean, we struggle in Burlington with narrow streets to get rid of our snow, so it could be plowed and trucked and dumped in a depot and then used for summer air conditioning. We've talked to the university about doing that. We haven't found anybody in physical plant particularly interested. They're a conservative lot, put it that way. But, you know, it would be a great demo project to try, because you could save energy by using that natural cold of the winter to air condition in the summer. Yes?
It's not that hard anymore to convince people that there is climate change. It's too obvious to ignore. Difficulty is the cause, and to accept the fact that it's human intervention, because you often hear, oh, well, there's always been scientists in history. So the problem is now not that there is climate change, it's why is it?
Yeah, and that's, you can bypass that one in some ways. I mean, I could talk for hours of why we know it's human-induced, right? That's my training. I'm a climate scientist. But I don't. And especially in the last couple of years, what I have learned when I am confronted with that kind of argument after giving a presentation like this is to say, does it matter if it's human-caused or not? Why don't we jump to that mitigation stage or the adaptation stage? The mitigation stage would be, well, a lot of people believe it's caused by carbon dioxide. What if we adopt technologies that don't involve carbon dioxide and improve your life, right? Or reduce our energy use or make it cheaper. So, example, put a heat pump in your house. Like, we've put 2 heat pumps in our house. During the swing heating season, we haven't fired our gas-fired boiler up until a week or 2 ago. We just turn the heat pump on when it's 61 in the house and we're a little chilly, right? And then the house warms up beautifully. It ends up costing a lot less. So I think you can look at some of this as like, well, it's cheaper and it's also more comfortable. We bought an EV. It cost me $4 on our nighttime charging rates to drive 200 miles in a little Nissan Leaf. Find any gasoline car that's going to do that. And we've had it for 3 years, and I've paid for swapping snow tires on and off and wiper blades. That's it. So I think you can talk about quality of life, you can talk about economics. You don't have to talk about saving the planet. And in fact, I've had this sort of epiphany maybe that I taught climate change a la Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth for a long time, which is the sky is falling. Oh my God, this is awful. That didn't work, right? Look at where we are right now. We've, as an environmental movement, tried that for 20 years. What if we talk about climate change in terms of comfort and health? You stop burning fossil fuels, you're going to decrease asthma rates. You're going to decrease the deposition of mercury in our Lake Champlain from Midwestern power plants burning coal. So all these other side benefits that come from climate change, and maybe we focus on quality of life, and we don't focus on climate change. We focus on economics, and it's cheaper. I think there are other ways to have this conversation. And if somebody says, I don't believe it's human, you're like, okay, fine, let's just deal with it as it is, whatever it is. We're still going to have to adapt. It's getting warmer, right?
Just don't say it's the data's from science, because that's become more.
It has, but you know, how many of you have cell phones on you here, right? Scientists and engineers designed those cell phones. The National Science Foundation did the fundamental work that allows us to have cell phones, paid for it. They did the fundamental work that allows you all to have CTs and MRI scans, and me too. That came out of fundamental science. So I guess, again, I'm being hopeful. I think this is a passing thing. It too will end. We will realize that science is driving a lot of the goodness in our lives and a lot of the comfort in our lives. At this political moment, no, it's really hard to think that. But we've been through dark times before, and we've come through those. And I think just, again, I'll reflect on my last 2 days here. The decency of the people that I've met and the kindness of the people I met is, I think, what is going to carry us through this. Because I think most Americans actually think that way. And we have a very vocal minority that's not that way right now. But the bulk of the people I meet and interact with as I travel, as I go around the state of Vermont, as I've been here, are good, decent people, even if they disagree. And I just have to hope that's where we go, because if we lose that hope, where are we, right? So, how about one last one, or we're done? All right, I see one last one.
How long was the drill that they drilled the hole with?
That's a really good question. The drill was about 40 feet long. So what's 40 feet? Half this room, maybe? What's the length of this room?
70 feet.
70 feet. All right, so almost half this room, a little more than half this room. but they put it on a big cable like a fishing line, and they would drill down 40 feet, and they would yank it back up and take out the ice, and then they would lower it down again and drill 40 feet on their big cable, and they would keep going till they got to the bottom. And that was it. So it wasn't a mile-long drill. It was a 40-foot drill on a cable that they had a big winch, and they would bring it back up and then drop it back down and bring it back up. Now imagine if that hole was a mile deep, that's 5,000 feet. They had to wind that winch a lot to get it back up. But that's what they did. All right, great last question. Thank you.
Okay, I want to say on behalf of Northhouse, I want to thank Paul for being here, and I also want to thank all of you. I want to remind you, we have many things to celebrate in this community, including a gal named Jessa Frost. There is cake, carrot cake, in back, and the movie is up ahead. We will pause it, start a little bit, so those of you who are going there can eat cake with us too. Here's a gift, Paul. Great to have you here. Thanks for coming.